The year is 1932. A doctor arrives in Macon County, Alabama, a rural stretch of the Deep South, where poverty is so absolute that most residents have never received medical care of any kind. He has come with an offer: free examinations, free meals on the days you come in, free treatment for what ails you. The government, he explains, wants to help. You have syphilis. He knows this. You do not. He has not told you the word. He has told you only that you have bad blood, a vague local phrase for a vague local suffering. And now the government wants to help you with it. You sign whatever needs signing. You show up when asked. You trust the men in their white coats and their government credentials because trust, in this moment, costs nothing, and hope is the only currency you have. What you do not know, what you will never be told, is that the government is not there to treat your syphilis. It is there to watch it kill you. For 40 years, the United States Public Health Service tracked the natural progression of untreated syphilis in nearly 400 Black men in Macon County. For 40 years, as the disease moved through their bodies, blinding them, deforming them, destroying their hearts and their minds, and finally their lives, the doctors kept records, attended follow-up appointments, published papers, and in 1943, when penicillin was proven to be a safe, cheap, and complete cure for syphilis, the men of the Tuskegee study were not given it. They were actively prevented from receiving it. The study continued for another 29 years. Welcome back to The Darkest Experiments, the series that goes inside the most disturbing, controversial, and morally complex research ever conducted on human beings. The series that asks not just what was done, but how it was allowed to continue, and what it tells us about the world we are still living in. We have covered experiments that caused psychological harm, physical suffering, and permanent damage to people who did not consent. But the Tuskegee Syphilis study occupies a category of its own, because it did not end in a week or a month or a year. It ended in 1972, and for most of its duration, a working cure existed that could have halted the damage at any point. This is not the story of a rogue researcher or a covert government program. It is the story of an institution, an entire apparatus of public health, medical publication, and professional respectability that looked at the suffering of 400 men and decided, year after year after year, to keep watching. The study began, as many ethical disasters do, with a question that was not unreasonable. Syphilis rates in Macon County, Alabama were among the highest in the country. Public health officials believed with some justification that understanding how the disease progressed in an untreated population could inform future treatment and prevention efforts. They also believed, and this is where the reasoning begins its quiet, catastrophic drift, that the men of Macon County were unlikely to receive treatment anyway. That the study was therefore not withholding care so much as documenting an absence of care that would exist regardless. That the research was in some sense victimless. That logic is worth examining carefully, because it will recur in different forms throughout this episode, and each time it does, it fails in exactly the same way. 600 men were enrolled, 399 had latent syphilis, the stage at which the disease has moved past its initial symptoms and is progressing silently through the body. 201 served as a control group. None of the men with syphilis were told their diagnosis. They were told they had bad blood and that the government wished to study and treat it. The incentives were modest and carefully chosen: free physical examinations, free meals on examination days, free burial insurance for their families, a significant benefit for men who had little and feared leaving their families with less. The medical procedures presented as treatment were not treatment. Lumbar punctures, spinal taps, a painful and moderately risky procedure, were performed under the guise of therapy. Placebos and ineffective tonics were distributed. The appearance of care was meticulously maintained. The men came in faithfully. They trusted the doctors. They had no reason not to. And then 11 years into the study, penicillin arrived. By 1943, it was clear that penicillin cured syphilis. Completely, cheaply, safely. The men enrolled in the Tuskegee study were suffering from a now curable disease. There was a straightforward path to ending their suffering, preventing further damage to their hearts and nervous systems, and stopping the transmission of the disease to their wives and children. The Public Health Service took that path and closed it. When the Wartime Draft Board began screening recruits for syphilis and arranging treatment for those who tested positive, the Public Health Service intervened to ensure that Tuskegee study participants were removed from the treatment lists. When local physicians attempted to provide penicillin to men they encountered who were enrolled in the study, the agency intervened again. The men were not simply denied treatment through inaction. They were actively protected from treatment, The machinery of the state was deployed not to care for them, but to ensure that the conditions of the study, untreated syphilis, observed until death, were preserved. The papers continued to be published. The peer-reviewed journals of American medicine carried the Tuskegee findings throughout the 1950s and 1960s. The methodology was described openly. The fact that the men were being denied treatment was not hidden from the scientific community. It was simply not challenged by it. Colleagues read the papers, attended the conferences, said nothing. That silence is, in many ways, the most important part of the story. In 1966, a young venereal disease investigator at the Public Health Service named Peter Buxton read the Tuskegee files and was disturbed by what he found. He wrote to his superiors. He was told the study was medically justified. He wrote again. He was told the study's oversight committee had reviewed the ethical questions and found the work sound. He continued to press his concerns for 6 years. He was ignored for 6 years. In 1972, Buxton took the story to a journalist named Jean Heller at the Associated Press. On July 25th, her report ran on front pages across the country. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Congressional hearings began within days. The study was halted. A panel found the research ethically unjustifiable and without scientific merit sufficient to offset the harm caused. New federal regulations governing human research were drafted in direct response. By the time the study ended, 128 men had died of syphilis or its complications. 40 of their wives had been infected. 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. In 1997, President Bill Clinton invited the 5 surviving participants to the White House and issued a formal apology. The men who came were in their 80s and 90s. They had spent their adult lives as subjects in a study they never truly consented to, carrying a disease they were never told the name of, denied a cure they never knew existed. Clinton said, "What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence." That silence, however, had consequences that a formal apology could not fully reach. The Tuskegee study did not simply harm the men who were enrolled in it. It damaged in ways that are measurable and ongoing the relationship between the African American community and the American medical establishment. Studies conducted decades after 1972 have documented lower rates of participation in clinical trials, lower vaccine uptake, and higher levels of medical mistrust among Black Americans, a pattern that researchers have directly and repeatedly linked to the shadow of Tuskegee. When the COVID-19 vaccines were developed in 2020 and vaccine hesitancy became a public health concern, researchers and physicians working in Black communities reported encountering the name Tuskegee again and again, not as a distant historical grievance, as a live present reason for caution, as a reasonable response to a documented history of betrayal. That is what 40 years of betrayal costs. Not just the lives lost during the study, the lives affected by the distrust it earned long after the study ended. Here is the thing that the Tuskegee study keeps demanding we sit with. None of this required a monster. It required something more banal and more frightening, an institution that had decided at some point early in its history that the men of Macon County were an acceptable category of research subject, that their vulnerability made them available, that their race, their poverty, their distance from legal protection and medical advocacy placed them in a different column than the researchers who studied them. It required colleagues who read the papers and said nothing. It required a committee that reviewed the ethics and found them acceptable. It required 6 years of letters from Peter Buxton, ignored by people who knew he was right. The Tuskegee study is not a story about what the worst people in a society are capable of. It is a story about what ordinary institutional structures, left without adequate oversight and unchallenged by moral courage, will permit to continue. And that story is not finished. The mechanisms that allowed Tuskegee to run for 40 years, the treatment of vulnerable populations as research resources, the gap between stated ethical standards and practiced ones, the professional silence of those who knew and said nothing, are not uniquely historical. They are features of any institution that operates without genuine accountability and genuine willingness to ask, who is bearing the cost of this? The men of Macon County bore the cost. They bore it for 40 years. They bore it in their bodies, in the bodies of their wives and children, and in a mistrust that their descendants are still carrying. Knowing their names, knowing what was done and why it was allowed to continue, is not a small thing. It is the minimum we owe them. Next time, we leave Alabama and move into the most classified corridors of the early Cold War. Before Project MKUltra became the most infamous mind control program in American history, the CIA was already running earlier, cruder, and in some ways more revealing experiments on unwitting human subjects. They were codenamed Bluebird and Artichoke. And what they tell us about the relationship between institutional power and the absence of oversight is something that belongs in this series. That story is coming right up. If the Tuskegee study moved you, if it changed the way you think about trust, about institutional accountability, about who bears the cost of scientific progress, leave a comment below. These conversations matter. Subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. And thank you, as always, for being here. I'll see you in the next one.